Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today, and welcome to this Agile Business Webcast Series broadcast, Continuous Integration to DevOps, the co-evolution of Agile and Automation. This webcast is brought to you by Agile Journal and CM Crossroads and is sponsored by Urban Code. I'm Patrick Egan, publisher of the Agile Journal, and I'll be your moderator today for this webcast. In a few moments, Jeffrey Frederick will join us to discuss the growth of Agile and the development of continuous integration into the practices of continuous deployment and DevOps. But before we begin, let me take care of a few housekeeping details. Our livecast environment is intended to be completely interactive, so you have the ability to post a question at any time during the broadcast by using the chat box that you see down below this screen. You also have the ability to chat with other attendees throughout the presentation as well too. We'll address all of your questions during a Q&A session later in the program. Also, you'll notice that you can pop out this chat window so it doesn't get hidden behind the slides by using the pop-up button you can see down there at the bottom of the screen. Also, if you'd like to share your thoughts about today's presentation, you can use the Twitter and Facebook buttons above the slide image so that you can follow along with your friends at home. And don't forget to use the hashtag AgileLC, and that'll let your tweets show up in the tweet roll that you can see over on the right side of the screen. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, just click the Resources tab at the right side of the screen. And you'll see a link there to download a copy of today's presentation, as well as other information about the session today. And finally, if you ever need to get a closer look at any slide during the presentation, just mouse over this screen and you'll see a full button pop up. Just click on that and it'll expand the screen to the entire size of the window. Okay, well, let me introduce our speaker today. Joining us today is Jeffrey Frederick, Technical Evangelist for Urban Code. Jeffrey is an internationally recognized expert on the area of continuous integration, and as an 18-year veteran in the software industry, Jeffrey brings a perspective of having performed and managed virtually every software development lifecycle. And as an early adopter of XP and Agile Software Development, a top committer for cruise control, and with 9 years of leading continuous integration efforts, Jeffrey has consistently been at the forefront of the industry. Jeffrey is currently indulging his passion for improving how software is made as a technical evangelist at Urban Code, and as the organizer of the Silicon Valley Agile Meetup, and the co-organizer of the Continuous Integration and Testing Conference, SITCOM. Well, Jeff, if you're ready to go, I'm going to turn it over to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick. Just a second, bring my slides up.
Should pop up there in just a second. There you go.
All right, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Basically, today we're going to be kind of looking at the long-term history of Agile and how it's really changed with evolution. And as the people involved have changed, and that's really led to changing practices. Now, this isn't no surprise. If we look back at the Agile Manifesto for software development, what you'll see is that very first line with the bullet points. Individual interactions over process and tools. Now, occasionally when I go to speak to groups of people in Agile, I'll sometimes have people who are new to Agile point out that line, individual interactions over process and tools. And they kind of go, wait, that, you know, if you're from a tool company, that must mean you're evil, right? That's what this line means. But I have to just tell people to relax a little bit, keep reading. And if you get down to the bottom of the Agile Manifesto, you say, look, there's value in the items on the right. Process and tools are valuable, but we value the items on the left more. And I think that's exactly correct. And that's kind of the thesis that I have here today, is that as the individuals evolved in Agile have changed, then you want different interactions. And that those differences in individual interactions really drive changes in process and tools. So that's my thesis, and that's supported looking historically. And we're going to go back in time, as I mentioned. And we're going way, way back in time. So far back in time, it's back when Microsoft was cool. Now, I know some of the younger people out there may not remember it, but there was a time in the early to mid-90s when Microsoft was really seen as being a technically dominant company. Their technical dominance really came before their market dominance. they really seem to know how to make software better than everyone else. Now, what happens is, as people from Microsoft started writing books about how they did that, then those of us in the industry read them and paid attention. And the book that I have up here on the left, Rapid Developed by Steve McConnell, this was one of the personally most influential books of my career. And in there, Steve McConnell does a couple different things. One is he's got a chapter on classic mistakes enumerated. And this is a chapter I still use today. You can find it online on Steve McConnell's website, and I recommend people check that out. It's a great resource. You know, we still make those same mistakes today, and I guess that's why we call them classics. But the part that's relevant to us in talking about Agile and automation is Steve lays out a series of best practices chapter by chapter. And the one in chapter 18 is the daily build and smoke test. And what he describes was that Microsoft at the time would do this daily build. They would build the entire code base for a project, even very large projects like Windows 95. They would build the entire project every single day. And they would run a smoke test on that build every single day. And they expected it to pass every single day. In the book at the right, by another Microsoftie, Jim McCarthy, The Dynamics of Software Development, he describes this practice as the heartbeat of the project. And that if you had working software that could pass the daily build, it could pass the smoke test, then you knew your project was on track. And similarly, if it failed, if the build failed, if the smoke test failed, that wasn't just a mild situation, that, you know, an issue of mild concern. It would be like your heartbeat stopping. It was a serious, high ceremony event, and if it failed, you know, there was a very serious investigation to make sure you got back on track. So this is really kind of an early practice that will lead into sort of the Agile practices that we have today. Now, it turns out one of the consequences of Microsoft's technical dominance was that they put the company Netscape out of business. And I hope that some of you may recognize that red dinosaur up there. That's Mozilla. Mozilla was the code name for Netscape Navigator. And if you've ever wondered why you go and download your Firefox today from the Mozilla Foundation and not the Firefox Foundation, this is why. This is because the name Mozilla goes back to that very first version of Netscape Navigator. So people are familiar that Netscape got put out of business, and of course they open source their code base, and as I said, grew into Firefox, which people are very familiar with and very influential. But that's not what's relevant to our story. What's relevant to our story was that in the same time they open sourced their code base, they open sourced their tool set. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the open source bug cracking system, Bugzilla, which now it comes to clear is derived from the Mozilla project. But what's really relevant to our discussion today is this other tool called Tinderbox. Now, Tinderbox is not very well known, but it is actually a very influential historically, because what Tinderbox was a system where you had several different machines supporting different tool chains, and by that I mean different hardware, software platforms, different compilers. Because the problem that Netscape had was that they had a very large C++ code base that ran on a whole raft of platforms, something like 13 or 14 different hardware software platforms, like HPUX and IRIX. And if you've ever worked with a large C++ code base, you know it can be difficult to keep it even compiling across different compilers, much less functioning correctly. And so the challenge was, how do we let developers know if they've broken something on one of these more obscure platforms? And Tinderbox was the answer. So what you have here is each column represents a different hardware software platform, and these machines are just compiling all day long. So that what you always have is a sense of whether the latest check-in passed the compilation stage or whether it failed. Now, this idea, it will be familiar to anyone who's familiar with continuous integration, and that idea kind of goes back to Tinderbox. And their idea of integration at this point was simply compiling, and yet that was the idea. Now, the term continuous integration, notes at the time Tinderbox came out. In fact, I've talked to some people who were at Netscape at the time, and they're not familiar with the term, even though they've had this influence. The term really came about shortly after, I think it was about 2000. Kent Beck came out with Extreme Programming Explained, first edition. And in there, he laid out the practices and principles behind XP, extreme programming. Now, as a reminder for people who may not have been there at the early days of XP, extreme programming didn't have anything to do with skydiving. It wasn't about programming while bungee jumping. Really what it was about was taking anything that was a good idea and seeing how far you could take it. Take it to the maximum, take it to the extreme length. Give it the spinal tap treatment where you turn it to 11. And if you think about it, think of an example of the practice of code reviews. Everyone agrees that code reviews are a very effective way to find defects, and code reviews are a good thing to do in a project. So extreme programming basically says we take code reviews and do them all the time, right? And thus you get the practice of pair programming. Similarly, if daily builds and smoke tests are a good thing, what if we did that all the time? What if we were to integrate our code all the time? And I think it's Ron Jeffries who first said this phrase, daily builds are for wimps. Real programmers integrate and test their code several times a day. So this is the introduction of the practice of extreme programming, just the manual practice. There's no real tooling involved here. But that changed in fairly short order. By 2001, the next year, the year of the Agile Manifesto, actually, we get the very first open source tools that can be identified as continuous integration tools, right? And interesting, if I said that the Tinderbox was influential, I worked on cruise control in 2001, and I'm good friends with Paul Julius, the founder of the project, and he and I had the same experience, which is we were inspired by Tinderbox, but we couldn't get it working on our projects. And that is what led to the founding of the cruise control project, and that's what I was looking for, a Java version, essentially equivalent for Tinderbox when I found cruise control. And so what we have here are these first projects that are influenced by the ideas behind Tinderbox and through extreme programming, this continuous integration idea. And they're really aimed at those people who are doing extreme programming, really hoping to support them in their practice. But a funny thing happened, which is that as soon as you have these tools, right, as soon as you have continuous integration, there's some ambiguity in the term continuous integration. Now, do you mean that you're doing manual continuous integration, that sort of XP white book continuous integration? And that is, are you actually integrating your work frequently? Are you frequently pulling changes from source control? Are you frequently committing your changes to source control? Are you committing several times a day? Because that's the XP style continuous integration. Or do you have this server that you've downloaded? You have this tool running in the background that will give you feedback whenever you do check in, whenever that may be. Now, these are two completely orthogonal practices. They happen to work very well together, but they both have the same motivation, which is about discovering problems early. Now, one thing that happened that was clear to me is that a lot of the people who were downloading these tools were not actually people doing extreme programming. They were actually just using the automated continuous integration piece, getting that rapid feedback, but were not, as a team, practicing the XP practices. Now, in a sense, that's not surprising. And to understand it, we can take a look at the elements of people, right? And this is actually my favorite title in all software development literature. This is Alistair Coburn. He's one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, and he wrote this article, Characterizing People as Nonlinear First-Order Components in Software Development. Now, it doesn't sound very humanistic, but if you parse it, it actually says people matter. In fact, Alistair says people matter so much that they are the primary determinant of project success. And because of that, it's worth studying the aspects of people as they relate to project success. And the number one thing, the number one trait of people that influences project success is this first one. People generally want to be good citizens. And by that, Alistair means that people care about their projects. They want them to succeed. And they care so much they're willing to go off script and solve problems as they come up to get the project back on track. And that's why projects are successful. However, he says, not all attributes of people are quite so beneficial towards project success. And in particular, he points out that people tend to inconsistency. Inconsistency. Now, that's a very funny word because it's not the word that you very often hear in, say, an engineering management meeting explaining why things went wrong in a project. You don't very often hear the problem is that people are just too inconsistent. But it turns out there's another word that you do hear that's kind of a synonym, which is that you might hear that people say that people just were not disciplined enough. Right? Discipline is that word that you hear all the time. And because the idea is that, we've laid out exactly what people need to do. We've laid out the 5 steps you should do every time you check in. Just do them the same way every single time. We have the document that describes how to do an installation of the software. Just follow it, right? Maybe there's 50 or 100 or 200 steps, but just follow each of those steps and there'll be no problem. And I think what Alistair's pointing out here is that these kind of practices, these disciplines, where you're expecting people to do the same thing the same way every single time is simply doomed to failure because people cannot be consistent. They are not machines. This then, though, I think is the real power behind automated continuous integration. Its great appeal, which is that it turns out that computers are fantastic machines. Computers are great at doing the same thing the same way every single time. And the way that CI works then is you have the computer be the machine. It provides that discipline, that consistency. And then when things go wrong, it gives the feedback to the people. And the people then want to be good citizens and they solve the problem, they get things back on track. And that's a fantastic situation and it works great. And we have really good numbers to back that up. And I really like this study from the IEEE that came out in 2003 in these early days of Agile. And what I really like about it is two things, which is one of the authors was working at HP and so had very good access to internal data. So that's number one. It's got a solid foundation in data from Hewlett-Packard. And the second was the assumption in the authors that you can just see right there in the title, trade-offs between productivity and quality in selecting software development practices. The assumption going in was that you can choose practices that will either make you more productive or that will improve quality. That was your choice, productivity or quality. But in fact, what did they find? They found that if you do builds at least daily and every time you check in, you actually run tests, what you end up with is that you're more productive and you have higher quality, right? And this is the effect of continuous integration. And it doesn't require you to be doing, XP. It simply requires that you have these elements of the at least daily build and at least and having that test every check-in. Now, if we look at what it takes to adopt these two practices, sort of manual continuous integration or agile or sort of automated continuous integration, it's not surprising that if people could get these benefits from automated CI without actually doing the manual practices, that they would choose the automated approach. And we can understand that by looking at something called the technology adoption lifecycle. The technology adoption lifecycle basically says if for any sort of shift in the market, any shift in practices or technology, you have sort of the bell-shaped curve that describes the population. And within that bell-shaped curve are distinct populations, distinct segments that sort of psychologically adopt these new changes differently. Now, there's a problem, though, with this particular representation of the curve, the smooth, continuous bell curve, which is that it's a lie. Right? We know it's flawed, and we have since Geoffrey Moore wrote his book, Crossing the Chasm, where he described, he said, look, because these different groups represent different psychology, different reasons to change, just because the technology gets picked up by someone early, and maybe innovators and early adopters, doesn't mean it's going to be picked up by everyone else. So if we wonder why, say, the Newton was very popular among innovators, but never really made much traction beyond that, we can kind of understand it as the gap there that separates between innovators and early adopters. Or why maybe PDAs were very common among early adopters, but didn't really make it to the mainstream population, right? And the idea that you have these gaps, these separations between the groups, and this is the key idea, which is the more disruptive a change is, the larger these gaps are, right? And if we look at what's more disruptive, if I just have, my whole team, I tell them, look, we're going to be doing XP now, we're going to change the way we work on our software, change the way you write code, change the way you work day to day, that's very disruptive. But if I say, keep working the way you have been, but we're going to go ahead and download the server that in the background, whenever you do your daily work, we're going to send you an email when something goes wrong, that's much less intrusive. And so it's no surprise that these tools for continuous integration would cross the chasm and enter mainstream before the actual manual practices that spawn them. We talked about feedback here as the key idea. We're really talking about matching the Agile of the day. Right, so Agile, as these practices were developed around Agile, even if the teams using the tools weren't always doing Agile. But what was Agile in the day, right? In these early days of Agile, what you had was small teams, right? The question of the day, I remember people asking, could Agile scale beyond 10 people, right? It was very developer-centric, right? XP is the dominant Agile methodology in the early 2000s. Right, and XP is all about how the developers write their software. It says very, very little about the other disciplines involved in software development. It's a very high discipline approach, right? XP is extremely methodical about how you do your work, as opposed to some of the myths people have heard about Agile, and it kind of assumed a co-located team, right? It's not surprising then that the feedback that people got was sort of very much revolved around the XP at the time. Very build-focused, very much about developer testing. Open source was extremely common. And you had feedback mechanisms like lava lamps, right? Because you were all in the same place. You could all see the lava lamp as in this picture. The green lava lamp tells you, guess what? The build is good, it's passing. There's also, of course, the email aspect of it, and people would write things like desktop widgets to give a virtual lava lamp kind of view. But the assumption was that you were going to be co-located. And that CI feedback, right? This often turned out, in my experience, to actually be training wheels for the other XP practices, right? You could get the CI tool in place early, you could get this kind of feedback. And once people got used to the feedback, it really was a foundational piece that you could build the other practices upon. So that's XP, that's Agile in the early 2000s. Now, something happened though. I'm gonna look at this through the terms of a couple of polls, right? If I look at the state of Agile in 2005, there was a tool, the survey that was done through Methods and Tools that basically asked, where are you in Agile adoption? And if you look at this, if you look at the pilot projects, you look at partial implementations, partially deployed, you end up overall with about 37% of people who said that they've done some level of Agile adoption. That's a fantastic number, right? If you go back to the crossing the chasm curve, 37% means you're really into the mainstream at that point. Now, the funny thing was, if we look at another poll done in 2005, we look at a very different view of what's going on, right? If we look at the Forrester survey, what's the state of Agile process in your organization? We only had 14% actually using it, right? Actually at the pilot stage or later. 37 to 14%, that's a tremendous difference. But that changed, right? If we go down, if we look at the difference between 2005 and 2008, what do we see if we go back and ask the same people run this pretty much the same survey? Now, Methods and Tools did show a significant boost. They went from 37 to 48%. But much more dramatic in my mind was the change in the Forrester results. The change from 14% to 26%, right? So clearly now even the Forrester markets crossed the chasm. What changed in here? Why is it that the management side was catching up? In my mind, it's because at those early days of Agile, as I said, was very developer-centric, very practitioner-centric. It really didn't offer upper management much. XP didn't really appeal to executives. Now, on the other hand, by 2007, 2008, there was a shift, and I think that this is the time period where Scrum is starting to become the dominant Agile methodology, because Scrum, with its focus on project management, with the need to create co-located or cross-functional teams, really requires management involvement, offers much more to management. And so that's the time period where management now says, okay, we actually need to get involved here and start being part of this Agile stuff. I think that really explains the differences between these two audiences, which is the Methods and Tools audience was much more the practitioners doing XP-style practices, and the Forrester results show the rise of Scrum as the dominant methodology. So what happens now as Scrum becomes dominant? As I said, when the individuals involved change, we expect the practices to change, right? So when we go now to Scrum, we start having not just small teams, but medium and even large teams. They're cross-functional. We're looking for a standardized approach, and we're looking to now have distributed teams, right? Distributed XP teams is something that people didn't really believe you could do in the early 2000s. But between 2009 and today, you really see this growth. And of course, what's happened is as we expect, the automation practices that go with it, CI itself has changed. So now that you have these large teams, we're now looking for self-service as a key feature. We're not talking about much more than just builds. We're also talking about running all kinds of tests and doing deployments as well, deployments into your test environments, and even deployments all the way out to production. If you've standardized on Agile, if you're doing Scrum across the organization, you'd expect your CI services are no longer just team level, but actually an enterprise level concern. So the idea of having an enterprise CI platform makes a lot more sense. And if you're going to have distributed teams, you have these teams all over the world working on the same project, you expect you're going to now have shared infrastructure. So some way that you can use this investment in the CI platform across all your different teams. And it was really this kind of changes that led to the enterprise CI maturity model. Now, we published this at Urban Code, but actually we didn't originate this. If you go back and look at our blog, you'll see that this is actually something that came out of the Continuous Iteration and Testing Conference, KitCon. And what happened was you had a lot of mature practitioners that got together and said, if you wanted to lay out a roadmap for people to adopt CI, what are the pieces you'd put on that roadmap? And so you lay out this maturity model that goes from introductory to novice to intermediate, advanced, and then insane. Extremely advanced practices. And then we kind of have in here targets for what it should be. Now, the interesting part about this is two things. First of all, that CI at this point was developed enough that you could actually put together a maturity model in a room full of people and get some consensus on it. That you certainly have to have a certain level of development to reach that stage. But also interesting is now we're talking about a lot more than just building, right? So if you look at the dimensions of this model, right, what you see is that there's a dimension for building, right? There's a dimension for deploying. There's a dimension out there for testing, right? And we're talking about all kinds of testing here. We're talking about unit testing now. We're talking about functional tests. We're talking about stack analysis. We're talking about getting code coverage results. So a lot of things going on here. Security scans, much richer level of involvement of QA at this sort of modern CI level. And finally, we get to reporting. Because if you are doing Agile that's management driven, you can expect that they're going to want reports that are the food of management, right? They're going to want pie charts. They're going to want graphs, and that's why the reporting becomes a very important aspect, because it's no longer just reporting information back to the team, back to those people who want to be good citizens, right? We're reporting also across teams, right? Can we inform the other people? Can we let our release manager know what they need to know that we're on track? Can we get users to give a heads up to operations about our timeline? Can we tell management how these different projects are doing? Can we report back information about our whole project portfolio, right? Reporting has become a much bigger aspect of these continuous integration systems now that you have these enterprise level deployments supporting enterprise level Agile adoption. Now, if we look at why people adopt these kind of systems, one of the things that's also striking to me is that as you've gone from XP teams to Scrum teams, if you've gone from sort of these early adopters that all had pretty similar reasons for adopting XP, looking for big improvements in quality and productivity. The reason people adopt Scrum, their goals for an enterprise CI system end up being very different, right? If you look across these different quotes, you'll see different highlights. Maybe they're looking for an easier time in audits, supporting a globally distributed Scrum team, the coordination across teams, even generating documentation and build materials. Now, these are all fantastic quotes, I think, that describe the reasons that people go for these kind of stuff. And they should be. I actually wrote all of these. I'll admit these are all sock quotes, a white paper that we wrote describing the enterprise CI maturity model. However, they all actually reflect different types of customers. The whole point of the CI white paper was to describe it's no longer one size fits all. It's really a question about customizing your tool set to your needs. And again, if we go back to the theme here, right, it's a question of what are the interactions that you have that you want to support. And it's using the tools and process to support those interactions that you want to have. And that's why you end up with very different answers, because different organizations have different needs. Now, where are we today, right? I actually found this quote from David Norton, a Gartner analyst who covers the Agile space last year on his blog. And you look at this. Clients told me of their plans to use Scrum on a $5 million project with 400 developers in 3 countries. I mean, clearly, we're a long way away from that question of, can Agile scale beyond 10 people? But this is the other thing I found. It's not the engineering practices that will trip us up. Continuous integration, test first, refactoring, right? Those core principles, those core practices that were there in XP in the beginning, those engineering foundations are still the same. These things are understood. That's what we need to be doing. The big question now in the enterprise Agile space is governance, right? That's kind of the leading issue. How do we manage our project portfolio in an Agile way? That's the problem that's not quite solved yet. But a lot of these other details, how we actually implement large-scale Scrum teams, you can go and get a book on that. If you want to know how to go and do a large-scale integration system, there's people out there who can go and sell them to you, describe how to go build one, right? These are kind of known solved problems. The leading edge is now out there at the management space, which is not surprising because that's where the space we've most recently evolved into. Now, governance, though, is not a topic that really relates to automation, so I'm going to go ahead and drop that at this point, and so go on to say how I really see Agile evolving in the future and what the implications are for automation. And I find kind of the next step of Agile I see as being lean, lean software development. For people who aren't familiar, lean software development is really a translation, pretty much a direct translation of lean manufacturing principles into the software development space. Now, there's 2 things I want to point out here. One is that Lean is not really new to Agile in a sense, because certainly if you talk to Kent Beck, if you look back at the early days of XP, it was very much inspired by the Toyota production system, by the lean manufacturing practices that were known. So the inspiration is not really different. What's really different is how direct that is in the translation into software space. And the second point I want to is this is not really new, right? This book, Lean Software Development, an Agile Toolkit by the Poppendieck's, that book came out in 2001, right? So this is not a new concept, but it's one that I really do see as gaining some amount of traction. And I think the reason for this is that Lean takes a holistic end-to-end view. And in my mind, that's really where we're evolving. As we have evolved Agile from being something very narrowly focused in development, as we keep growing it like the layers of an onion out to get more and more of the organization, you reach the point where you say, well, look, we really need to consider the whole system here from end to end, and that's really what Lean excels with. Now, to see how Lean relates to Agile, I would point to look at that first principle of Lean, which is to eliminate waste. And what we have on the right are the 7 wastes of software development, and the ones in the red, extra processes, task switching, waiting, motion, defects, are all ones that I think are addressed by automation. And so I'm going to go ahead and use some of the tools of Lean software development to illustrate that. And what I'm using here is something called a spaghetti diagram. A spaghetti diagram comes as a lean manufacturing technique where you sort of have a diagram showing the shop floor and you put your pen on it when a widget enters the shop floor, and you just trace along the shop floor the path that widget takes throughout the entire manufacturing process. And if what you end up with looks like a plate of spaghetti, you're doing something wrong. You want to even things out. Now, the equivalent of that kind of motion in software development terms are handoffs. And so we're looking at here the handoffs between different peoples and systems through a process which you're probably all familiar with. And what we've done here is we've spaghetti diagrammed what happens when a developer finishes working on a new feature, and they're going to need to have it tested. So, but when they do that, there actually is a defect, and they need to fix it and then have it revalidated. This is the path that we take. First the programmer needs to go and have it built, so they reach out to Bob. That's right, Bob the builder is going to build the software. Many of you probably have a Bob that is in charge of running your builds. So once Bob's finished the build, he lets Pam know. Now Pam can go back to the person who does the deployments, which of course is Dan the deployer. Dan's going to go ahead and take that built software, deploy it out to the test environment, and then now we can let the tester know that, yep, you can go ahead and get started, and they can go ahead and test it. But alas and alack, they find a defect. Now eventually, that defect information makes its way back to Pam. She fixes the defect, and we go back through this cycle again. And what we have here is a pretty complex set of handoffs, a lot of back and forth between the different actors involved. And critically, at each one of these places, each one of these people has an opportunity to be a bottleneck, to be a delay, right? It's certainly not uncommon for people need to wait for builds and wait for deployments. Now, with automation, though, we can really streamline this process, right? If we're going to go ahead and put an end-to-end automation system in place, what do we end up with? Well, now, when Pam commits her change, we have an automatic build happening. In fact, not only do we have an automatic build, we have an automatic deployment can happen out to a test environment. And we can automatically run our tests, our unit tests, our functional tests, our static analysis. And if those automated checks can actually find the defect, then we can let Pam know automatically right away, and she can immediately fix the problem. We go back to the cycle, and when Tom comes to test the software, it actually works, and we're done. And this makes a tremendous difference on productivity. If you consider like the average development team, which in my experience actually only deploys to QA maybe twice a week, then you're talking about cutting down the time it takes to go through the cycle from 8.5 days down to about a day. And this is really the lean view of what's happening, which is we're looking for bottlenecks, we're looking to remove them, and we're looking at the impact on cycle time. And if we can go ahead and reduce our cycle time on some part of our process from 8.5 days down to 1, that's a huge, huge win. So that's kind of the lean view of this sort of automation. And it kind of lends to what we call the build promotion or build pipeline model, where we have a unified system that's going to allow us to build, deploy it to each of our test environments, go through our sign-off, our staging production in one unified pipeline, leveraging the same kind of automation from environment to environment, removing bottlenecks, removing opportunities for failure, And this kind of just, if you want to learn more about it, you can find out more in our webinar on implementing, build, deploy, test, release automation in the enterprise, which you can find the recording for that on the Urban Code website. So this is the view that Lean lends itself to, this holistic end-to-end view. Now the problem, though, if you look at where we are today, is that very often people can't actually implement these in organizations. Right? Very often, these traditional silos that you have, the development side of the house and the operations side of the house, prevent this from actually being put in place. Right? We have customers who've been able to be successful with it. But we have others who've run into these organizational silos where basically the operations people don't allow the development time tools to have access out in the operations land, out in the data center. Right? And so it's very common that you might have operation-centric tools that are being used for automation out in the production environment. And then you have a separate set of tools that are being used in the development side, and you have this sort of gap between the development and operations side, and bugs and defects result, slow handoffs result because of this gap in the automation between the two groups. Now, it's to address that gap that really has led to what I see as being currently the leading edge of Agile. Right? In my mind, it's striking that the leading edge of Agile software development is actually no longer in development. It's actually put in operations in what is being called the DevOps movement, which is really focused on breaking down the barriers between development and operations. And you can think of DevOps as kind of being Agile for systems or implementing Agile infrastructure. This DevOps movement was relatively new. Right? It was really started by Patrick Dubois, and when he had the initial DevOps days conference back in 2009. And at this point, there's meetings on DevOps. It's kind of a burgeoning movement. I found 14 meetups on meetup.com. By contrast, there's something like 34,000 meetups or something like that for Agile in meetup.com. It's a 100-fold number, maybe it's 3,400. There's a tremendous number more of Agile meetups, much more established. But I do think this DevOps movement is timely because it really is well timed to solve this problem that Lean is starting to run into, where you have people who want to put that Lean view end-to-end in place, but the traditional silos are an obstacle. The really key insight for DevOps in my mind is that if you go back to Agile Manifesto, it talks about working software over comprehensive documentation. And the key insight here is that by working software, we now mean working in production, right? If we think all the way back in time to that daily build and smoke test that you had at Microsoft in the early to mid 90s, now that was really just talking about could you get that smoke test working in the development side. Now we're saying how long does it take you to get this new feature, right, working out in production? That's really our key metric. And so I think that DevOps will be a fantastic movement, will be a fantastic enabling movement to help support the spread of lean thinking into the software development organizations on both the development and operations side. And eventually, I think really end-to-end, so from the time that the customer, the business has an idea until they can get it working, that's really the purview of lean. And DevOps will be a key part of that. So this is I think, in my mind, the cutting edge of Agile, and where the evolution of Agile and automation has brought us is to DevOps. And I want to just sort of give a retrospective on what this means in the technology side by going back to a blog entry from James Shore. Jim is another Agile Manifesto co-center. He's a winner of the Gordon Pask Award from the Agile Alliance. For great service to the Agile community. In 2005, he wrote a series of blog articles called things like Why I Hate Cruise Control and Continuous Integration on $1 a Day. And Jim's point was making that people who were only adopting the tools but not the principles and practices of Agile were missing the point. He says, look, you can do continuous integration with a rubber chicken. And here's how you do it. If you want to go check in your code, first you go get the chicken. If someone else has the chicken, that means you have to wait. Now, when you successfully acquired the chicken, that means that you now have permission to pull the latest changes, integrate your changes with them, and then run your build, run your tests. And if it all passes, then you get to check in, and you can ring the bell and let someone else have the chicken. And you know what? As funny as this may sound, this works, right? This sort of physical lock control, whether it's a rubber chicken or a funny hat or whatever it might be, it really can work. Of course, it requires that you're all in the same place where you can all share the chicken. right? And so while it works, I really don't think this represents the future. I think the future looks much more like the system that was described by Timothy Fitz for what they do at IMView, which is the practice of continuous deployment. And he described this in a blog entry called Doing the Impossible 50 Times a Day. And what happens at IMView is that when a developer checks in a change, it will, of course, go and run a CI build that will run their unit tests. And if any of those tests fail, not only do you get an email, actually your change is reverted out of source control, right? If you're not allowed to break the build on your check-in. Now, if you happen to pass the unit test, you get sent off to this system here. And it may look a lot like Tinderbox. You have different columns. And that's because it is kind of a similar idea. What we have here are different machines running their hours and hours of functional tests in parallel, with the goal of having the whole suite of hours and hours of functional tests complete within 15 minutes. Now, if you can manage to make it through this gauntlet of functional tests, then your change will be deployed automatically out to their production environment. Now, it doesn't go to their entire production environment. It goes to some subset of their users. And once it's on one particular machine, on some cluster, they're going to monitor that machine. They're going to monitor the business metrics on that machine, asking the question, are we making the same number of dollars per minute with these latest changes as we were making beforehand? If we are, if we've not impacted our business metrics, then we're able to actually deploy this out to the rest of our cluster. And with that, your change will have made it from the time you checked in out to production, hands off, with everyone using it. And this is a process they go through 50 times a day. Right? Now, in my mind, this kind of system is much more the future. And also, this is a system that is not something you can do with a rubber chicken. So that's it for my presentation. Hopefully, I've kind of shown you from the sweep of history how Agile has changed over time, how the individuals involved of Agile have changed, and that the interactions we want from these individuals have really led to a dramatic change in our process and tools. And hopefully, too, you can where you are in this evolution, and by looking at this timeline, see kind of what your next steps are likely to be. And with that, we'll open it up for some questions.
Great, Jeff. Thanks. Great presentation again. And don't forget, if you have any questions for Jeff, use the event chat box below the slide. Well, one question that I have for you is, how does DevOps relate to continuous deployment, or are they kind of the same thing?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, if you look at an environment like IMView, that's practicing continuous deployment. That's sort of automated deployment after every check-in. Out production, it certainly requires a DevOps sort of spirit, right? They very much have, if you look at IMView, they were very much inspired by Lean and that sort of end-to-end flow question. So in that sense, I think there's a similar motivating spirit, but the practices aren't synonymous, right? You very much can have a DevOps kind of culture. So I would say that you probably can't be successful implementing continuous deployment without DevOps sort of spirit, whether you call it that or not. On the other hand, you might have a DevOps kind of spirit in an environment where continuous deployment isn't the goal, isn't desirable. So the real focus of DevOps in a more traditional environment would be to let's automate what we can, let's streamline the handoffs, but maybe we're still going to keep controls in place to actually push the button to go live. We're going to try to make that as seamless as possible, make our infrastructure as agile as possible.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, one question that came in, so we aren't doing Agile at all, but we do some continuous integration on some teams. So does a build pipeline approach still make sense for us?
I think so. So, it's really common that people start off with, Agile very unevenly distributed across their projects. And so maybe they have some pilot projects or some teams, maybe, like I said, who were not doing Agile at all, but have just picked up the practice of continuous integration. I think in those environments, your motivation for adopting a build pipeline are purely pragmatic, which is to say, in the same way that, first of all, if your teams that are doing CI are benefiting from it, they're getting that fast feedback, and that's allowing them higher quality and higher productivity, why wouldn't all of your teams want that? Right? It's not really about Agile at that point. It's really about being pragmatically, we'd like to be more productive. We'd like to have fewer defects. So having the kind of infrastructure that can support that to all your teams, I think, makes sense. And then I think once you have continuous integration build happening, I think the build pipeline approach is simply the next logical step. It basically says, all right, we've gotten what we can out of the CI build. We're getting that fast feedback. Maybe we have a few unit tests, but we have all these other tests out in QA. How can we start getting the benefit of those? And the way that you're going to do that is by having a system that can then take those builds that have passed your unit tests, deploy them out to a test environment, run those automated functional tests that QA has developed, and get those feedback. That's just simply the next logical step in CI, which is why I do think that build pipeline approach is generally applicable, even if people are not really looking to be agile. It's just simply pragmatic at this point.
Sure. Well, here's another question that just came in. So we have legacy systems and processes that are in direct conflict with these ideas. So we have to live in both worlds. How do you overcome that kind of conflict?
That's a great question. And if people don't know, we at Urban Code, we do these Agile Come to You seminars where we travel across country and talk firsthand to people about Agile. And this is that comes up very, very commonly. Which is we have the legacy systems, and what was interesting here is the question about legacy processes. I think it's worth. I'm gonna look at two parts of my answer here. One is first is what do I mean by legacy? Right. I was blown away when someone told me what the definition of a legacy is. You see, legacy is something valuable that you inherit. Right. So I think the instinctive reaction for people who want to be more agile is that whatever was happening before must be wrong, right? Because it's conflicting with what we want to do in Agile. But I don't think that's the right attitude to take. I think the first thing you do is look at why do you have the legacy practices you have, and is there some valuable ideas that you can glean from there? So, for example, perhaps in your legacy system you have a change control board that needs to approve every change that goes out, and that's clearly going to be in a great difference conflict with the continuous deployment where things are happening automatically. But I think if you say, well, maybe it's valuable for us to have that control from an Agile side of view, what can we do to automate that practice as much as possible? And actually what we find is that people who have both worlds, that the Agile side tends to emphasize the efficiency and productivity side, and the legacy world tends to emphasize control, that actually automation ends up being a place where those two sides can come together, because the automation allows them to be very efficient, but at the same time gives them fantastic control and insight into what's actually going on in their environment. In my experience, that by implementing automation, you actually improve both efficiency and control. So there's no need for these two sides of the house. You very much can have a very common automation platform that will satisfy both sets of users. Right. My favorite story around this is one about one of our users that was audited, and the question they were asked by the auditor was, it's a pretty daunting question. So the equivalent of, what version of your software was deployed on October 11th? Who put it there and why? But by look back in their automation records, they could say, well, the last deployment to that environment, production environment, was actually on September 15th. And you can see it was John was the one who pushed the button, but it was signed off by these people. And here's all the changes that were in it. Here's all the issues that were closed. Here's our test results. That all can come out of your automation system. Do you have any other questions? If you can answer the first question in audit that succinctly, the rest of the audit's going to be very easy, right? I just think that in my mind that's the perfect illustration of how there doesn't need to be a conflict between the automation side and the Agile side and the legacy side when it comes around to implementing automation.
Great. Well, here's another question for you, kind of getting into how to get this going, but how would you bootstrap better interaction between the devs and the ops?
That's a great question. I think the first place it has to happen through is definitely is conversationally. But but I will say this: it's worth, even before you start having the conversation, to examine the system that you have in place in the company to make sure that you haven't ended up with any sort of boneheaded conflicts. And my favorite example was the company where, on the one hand, on dev side, they're being pushed and even incented in the form of management bonuses to have more frequent releases. But at the same time, on the operations side of the house, they're being incented and bonus to have fewer deployment failures. Now, if you look at these two sets of incentives, they're actually in conflict, right? Because from the operations point of view, The easiest way to have fewer deployment failures is to have fewer deployments, right? If we cut the number of deployments we do in half, well, logically, we'll have half as many deployment failures. So that's a case where the organization, it was a classic case of the left hand and right hand, having different motivations. And that's the kind of conflict that you need to solve before you start looking at having the conversations between ops and dev. As at the high levels of management, do we have a consistent view of what our goals are? If you do, then I think you're in a situation to go to the dev and ops team saying, we now know what we want to have. We want to have this more streamlined interaction, this better handoff. You guys go figure it out, right? You're at that point, you're ready to have the conversation because you have that common set of goals. You have that alignment. And it will require changes on both sides. There's going to need to be some things that the devs can say, what can we do? Maybe they need to involve operations earlier. One example I can remember was a team where one of the holdups in going to operations was because they had the ops database admin would review all of the SQL scripts that were being used, all of the SQL statements used in the code base to make sure that none of the Oracle optimizations broke. And that was something that was only done at the very end of the project. By incorporating that admin into the team earlier on, whenever any SQL was changing, they're able to start getting much more rapid feedback. And at the end, they didn't have this long review period. So they're able to streamline their process by getting the ops people involved earlier. That was a change in the development culture, but it was one that led to this benefit for both sides. And I think that's the kind of thing that you need to be looking for, is those win-win scenarios by having that earlier communication in a release.
That's some great ideas. Hey, so here's another kind of a lengthy question that just came in. So what other practices and disciplines are involved in the pipeline model? In other words, if the code is being pulled from the artifacts and a bug has been discovered in the test environment, wouldn't the code exceed the test deployment?
Wouldn't the code development exceed it? So I'm going to try to restate that, make sure I understand. I think what they're saying is, so if you have this pipeline and you reach the test environment and there you discover a bug, what do? You don't want to keep it in the pipeline. And that's exactly right. You have this pipeline as your model of how things will progress, but not every build continues all the way through the pipeline, right? Most builds will stop before getting to production at some point. So there might be a few builds that you happen per day that actually don't go to the test environment. Maybe you only update the test environment twice a day, morning and evening, or morning and afternoon rather, and you have several CI builds in between. And then you probably have actually multiple test environments. My diagram was very simplified, but it's very common for customers to have maybe a functional test environment, maybe a system integration test environment, then a performance test environment, a user acceptance test environment. And so you'll have any number of builds that will stop in one of these environments because of a defect that's discovered, a performance regression, what have you. And anytime you find a defect, well, of course, that means you're going to need to have a new build coming out and a new pipeline started. And that's kind of what happens in the pipeline approach, is that when you find a defect that halts the progression of one build, you have another build coming in behind it. Another way to think of this is kind of like we might consider the train model, which is you have these regularly scheduled trains and kind of you have these regularly scheduled builds. If a feature or a bug fix doesn't make one build, it's going to be in the next one. I guess the only difference is that not all the trains make it to the destination. They pause along the way, they get picked up by the next one. And that's kind of what happens in practice with the pipeline model.
Alrighty, well, we're about out of questions. So any final thoughts for our audience before we let you go?
I just say, people might look at this and hear about these very mature automation systems, and I think the common reaction is kind of be blown away, both by what's possible, but also I think it's sort of daunting. And for that, I kind of remind people of the story about the best time to plant a tree. The best time to plant a tree is 100 years ago, and the next best time is today. In the same way, it'd be ideal to have these systems already in place in your environment. But I can tell you that IMView, that continuous deployment system that looks so awesome, it took them about 5 years to get into place. So, you might realize that you're a long way away from that today, but the only way to get closer to that is to actually get started. And I think what you'll find is that you start getting benefits from these systems very early on that support the future investment. So just begin the process is my biggest advice.
Great advice. Well, thanks for joining me today, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Patrick.
And if you'd like more information about Anthill Pro and Urban Code, you can see this little ticker there rolling across the bottom of the screen. Just use that click button to go to the Anthill Pro Resources Center. And if you'd like to view other webcasts like this, just come on back to Agile Journal and go to agilejournal.com/webcast. And this presentation will be online for on-demand replay tomorrow. And also, if you'd like a copy of today's slides, again, go ahead and click on the Resources tab on the right side of the screen, and you can download a PowerPoint copy of the presentation. Well, thanks again, Jeffrey, for joining me, and thanks to everyone who helped put this presentation on today. I look forward to seeing you at our next webcast. Bye-bye, everyone.